now get settled. Let's move on.
Sweet teas.
All right. Thank you for coming back. At this point, we have reserved about 10 minutes, which means it translates into 2 minutes for each group of the 5 groups that we have, where at least one member will share with us the major arisings, the deliberations that you might think you want to share with the rest of the participants. So just tell us a point or two that you might think is of interest to the rest of us. So we might want to begin by those who are in agriculture, and that perhaps Dr. Nyambara is in. Is he in? It's not okay. Just coming in. Can you proceed straight this side, Doc?
Okay,
So the rest of the other groups will prepare so that we share those things that you think are key in your deliberations.
Yeah, we'll be very exciting discussion. Luckily, we are dealing with one, dealing with family in one situation, and the other insights of that in Zimbabwe, for the colonial period. And I didn't know that it was never a explanation of title that is here. And yet another student was looking at coffee marketing, and the fourth one on this company, private company, which is promoting current 80s in some part of the country. So one of the major weaknesses that we identified in most of them, the presenters or the papers that are working, is the absence of a global context. For example, the contract farming paper simply talking about the situation village and the village situation, contract farming there, without this broader connection in the global world. The price is the villagers are satisfied with the price, but there's also a need to know what the marketing issue is out there, who is determining the price of the tobacco, and so that missing that presentation. And then the Kowa Pakul concept, yeah, this private company, it's not quite clear whether it's a private company seeking profit or it's an NGO, so it presents problem, and it operates only for a decade. In the end of the 1980s, it withdraws itself, which shows that it really faced a lot of problems because it wasn't coming out clearly as to whether it was a private company or an NGO and seeking profit for that matter. So anyway, those were some of the major findings of I think the comments given for most of the especially the lack of a global context in the commodities that societies are students are dealing with. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nyambara. We will then move on to those who are dealing with the political economy of development in Southern Rhodesia. Thereafter, we'll go to finance, mining, and then lastly, interdisciplinary studies. So, political and economic development, anyone from there might want to share with us?
I think the key thing that came out from right across much of what we discussed in terms of like our projects. I think questions around how to demonstrate significance particular research agenda. So we discussed ways that could be done. Also about literature suggestions, particularly around the project that is looking at displacement and homelessness in the metropolis. And then other concerns that arose, basically clarifying a few issues that arose in earlier programs today. One of which I think actually I could dwell on was there was a real was the thing that came up, concerns of whether the quality of degrees from Zimbabwe impacted in any way on opportunities for study and scholarship in the United Kingdom. That was about it.
Thank you so much for the summary.
Okay. Yeah, so we had 4 fantastic papers on finance, which is not my area of strong suit, but they were brilliant. They were mainly all 4 historically driven papers that looked at various aspects of, 3 of which looked at various aspects of finance, and 1 looked particularly at the politics of aid. So we looked at, there was 1 paper which talked about taxation in the Rhodesian period, another paper that looked at insurance, and a third that looked at the war fund which existed during the Second World War. One of these great papers, and there was a 4th which looked at aid, which looked at particularly the case of Christian Care and the history of Christian Care's operations within the country. So they were all very interesting and empirically rich papers that told really interesting histories, stuff that I had not heard before. And the justification for a lot of them had been because they haven't been told before, which is fine. But it's all, it needs, the significance of these papers, as Miles said, in part needs to be derived from its position within debates that can mean things in different contexts. And I think that was the first and foremost thing that came out of our discussions, is how and where you root these arguments and these kind of cases in specific literatures where you've got a particular issue that you're grappling with that's laid out right at the top, right at the beginning of the study. So that was the first aspect. And the second point that we talked about briefly was, because these are all really interesting papers that are based and rooted in history, where is it that you want to apply to at Oxford? So where do you want to go with these projects? Because I think that's important in considering how you frame and organize your proposal. It's not just a case of re-rendering kind of like a historical study if you're going to apply for the Department for International Development for a master's there or for African Studies. So if we're considering what buttons do you need to press if you're applying or if you're putting your proposal for a specific department, what does that then entail, and how do you do that? And doing straight history for an international development program is, you need to be able to work it and massage it in a particular way where it says something significant and meaning to the people that will be reading it, which they might not be Africanists and they might not be even related onto that theme, so it needs to have that kind of broader purchase. So those were the kind of two aspects: 1, literature, and 2, thinking about where you're going to go with it. And the third, obviously, again, with regard to proposals, is how you're going to build from this. How can you demonstrate that, where is this leading to, and where does that go to as a consequence of that? So all of these papers did this, or at least could be improved on in doing that. And that was the kind of, like, I think, key findings that came out of our discussion.
All right, thank you. We are the papers emotionally balanced.
they were emotionally balanced. I am emotionally balanced.
All right, we move on to the next one. We'll name at the order now. Let's see who will come after this one. That's mine.
Okay.
All right.
I don't know whether Usha or I should speak.
Please.
Okay. You can add in what I forget. So I think our group would actually echo a number of the themes that have been raised already. But I should start by saying we had 4 absolutely spectacularly interesting papers. They are all about mining, but in quite different ways. But But the thing they had in common is that they're all detailed, rich, and dramatic because they're reflecting the very up and down kind of history of mining in this country in the last 30 years. So all of them were picking up on mine closures, sort of dramatic shifts in labor, attempts to enforce corporate social responsibility, what happens to women's labor in particular contexts, but all at moments of really dramatic change, which I think are incredibly revealing. So they all had huge potential, I think, for saying something really important. And we were pushing people in each case to sort of say, well, what exactly are you talking about here? I think 3 out of the papers could be about a whole range of different topics. They were just bubbling with different things that they could have been about. So in a way, it was about constraining them and saying, all right, pick one. You can't do so many at once. And then really, dig down in that one. And then there was one which was a really focused topic on the corporate social responsibility, but could have been, opened up to ask lots more questions about that and maybe develop a kind of comparative aspect to it. But they were all incredibly rich. If they were to move forward to kind of thinking about publishing that research, it would be a question of really focusing and developing the arguments in them. All of them needed to really think about what literatures they're talking to, and I think that's what everyone else is also saying to a certain extent. Yeah, but they were fantastic, and it was a real pleasure to hear.
All right, thank you. In the last group, they are still debating as to who is Let me just.
Thanks. So we had about 11 people in our group, maybe, so it was rather large, and we didn't manage to get through all the papers, but the papers we heard were fascinating, and I think basically our discussion went the same way as in most other groups. What other literature are you going to link this to? What kind of debates can you engage with, so that non-experts like myself on particular topics would also be interested in reading this. One thing that came out of our discussion as well was the incredible richness of the empirics that were there and the vast ability that everybody who presented their work had to engage with what they found during their research. One thing we would have liked to have heard a bit more about in that context was the methodology used. So there were some questions around that maybe other groups did not mention yet. But other than that, basically very similar points to what we've heard before. And we just want to thank everybody for their contributions, because really great work out there. So thanks.
All right, thank you all for the job well done. Perhaps my advice to the people whose papers have been discussed, you must be careless against sending them to predatory journals. All right, thank you so much. Nice. Allow me to hand over this time to the Director of Ceremonies, who is not up forward. He will guide us as to what next is coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. We are going to proceed. As he has initially indicated, we had shuffled a little bit all the stuff on the program, and where we had started with a small group discussion, we now move on to what should have happened first. So we are now going to look at the politics of research, shared and cutting-edge research interests. And here I'm going to invite Dr. Kulinani, and then he's going to be working with Dr. Makombe, Dr. Dombo, Professor Mazarire, Sinkai Chikudu, and so on. So, shall I hand over to you?
Right. In the interest of time, I think I'll just be quick. Basically, the idea of this session is to, speak about our researches, and perhaps the environment within which we perform them. So I'll start with the environment, which I hope we will not discourage some of you. But basically, I think this is the usual story. It's not so easy to not only publish, but also bring quality publication from this part of the world because of sometimes pressure, teaching, and also in the case administration, several other pressures that come along the way. So you discover that, and even with the pressure of publishing or perishing, the numbers game if you want, you are trying to also push numbers while at the same time you are doing a lot of other things. Now here's the catch. How do you, as a historian, for example, continue to make a heavy presence in research and publication when one of the requirements is that at least you should be in the field, right? Which will take away from, which is likely to take you away from your workspace, right, where you are teaching. So, for example, in this university, it's very difficult to get leave during the semester. I mean, it's not possible to ask to get leave, for research during the semester. And even during vacation, it's a limited time. We have 15 weeks during vacation, but there's, I think, a whole lot of the first month is marking, and you have to leave after you have submitted your marks and done the board meetings. So the first month, so that reduces to even 2 months or less. All right. So, and getting funding for research, I was only fortunate once. Remember the ONRI project in my little history of small history of very young history of research. Only once have I got funding for research. Yet elsewhere in the globe, it's very easy to get, not easy, but it's very possible to get research long term, especially, and that even has an impact on your teaching. I was telling colleagues the other time that I have a friend from Sweden, Eric Green, who tells me if I get funding, then my teaching is less, right? For every funding I get, then it means a less teaching load. And there are something like 7 staff members where they've, probably an equal number of students, so it's possible to research, in such an environment and bring cutting edge research. So we have this, but this is not justification for mediocre, right? It's just perhaps giving a context. Having said that, in my department we have moved towards this direction. We now encourage partnership between students and lecturers in terms of publications. So we are saying, guys, we have been walking this path, doing your honors, your master's dissertation, and we've been going through a lot in that process, guiding each other and so forth. Should we let it rot in our shelves, or we find ways to bring it to the public? And one way is to do the book projects. I will assure you ours are not under the tree. We have already, I have one that we have produced, I think 2 weeks ago, on entitled Victors, Victims and Villains, Women in Music. One I worked with Anya Kuchga and Shnori. And we are working on another on survival strategies by Zimbabweans, and we've been taking our time precisely because we are trying to maintain quality. So this is like the 2nd year working on that book. We have received reviews from Mlambo, Sarah, George. I think there are 4 guys we have. So there are quite a lot of comments. So we are addressing those, and we have sent some of the comments to the this is over and above our own reading, right? The 4 of us who are editing that book, reading and then sending it. So there's been a lot of back and forth with authors, all in the name of because we have our name stuck there, and that thing is going to be permanent. And so you want it permanent with a good name. I mean, with a good work, which brings good name. So this is some of the things. So we have about 3 book projects in the department that we're working on. And we're taking our time precisely because we are trying to maintain quality. The other is Agrarian Revolution, or Evolution. Then the other one is on, which is like in the process of being conceived. I think it's past conceptualization, Dr. Nyambara. Financial regimes in colonial. Now I'll show you Dr. Nyambara will deliver a quality piece in terms of that book process. So one of the things we've been doing there is to encourage students to partner with the lecturers and so forth, and then come up with pieces of work that are state of the art. We are also doing the special issue direction. So we have a special issue that I am leading from gender perspectives in Zimbabwe, but we are doing this with Zambezia, which is quite an advanced stage. But as an individual, I've also tried to solve the nightmare of archives. You only see me there when I'm introducing students, perhaps not doing the research itself. And the trick has been to turn myself into an archivist of sorts, where I've developed interest in social media. And what I've been doing is I'm in several groups for different reasons. And one of the reasons is research. I assure you, when you see me on Facebook, I'm doing research. So what I do there is I collect, for example, the first experiment was with Makwara, where we were looking at, we presented the piece in Switzerland, where we were looking at pills, Tajamuka, and this flag, and trying to make an argument or a case for passive resistance using social media, comparing those 3. Then the next was engendering humor on the social media, where we collected a lot of humor, very interesting humor on men and women, right? And then we try to theorize that kind of humor. And then another is on humoring the Zimbabwean economy. I mean, being an economic historian, you want also throw in something related to your area of study. So you have a lot of jokes about the Zimbabwean economy, and we are trying to theorize and tell a story there. The third and last is on humoring the transition. All right, the jokes about the the changeover, the military changeover. I think I'm trying to be careful in my choice of words. So those have been. So what is easy about this kind of research? We collect the information and then we sit down, and I'm working with students in those pieces of research. We collect material, then we sit down and we try to analyze, come up. The board of literature we're engaging is more or less similar. That's the exciting thing, or this thing. It's more or less similar, board of literature. And then we engage. I've been working with George as well, George Kakoyanan, because he's working in a similar area on social media and so forth. And so we've been doing a lot of, exchanges and encouragement, I guess, from his part, to be not to be embarrassed about desktop, because there's the story as usual. Desktop research, we found it. You're not in the archives, you're not the historian, but we are trying to move towards the direction of being an archivist, historian. I hope that makes sense. Thank you. And I hope it's cutting edge.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Fa. I'm going to invite Dr. Dombo to come and make this brief presentation. Let's clap hands for you.
Thank you, Dr. Will. Right. One of the serious indictment on the research was a statement that was uttered by my Vice Chancellor concerning a colleague whom I will not mention. He said, you just write about just about everything, even on someone who is going into the toilet. So I mean, it's something that may be funny at face value, but on a more serious note, I think it really put historians or any serious academic on the spotlight. Or what is it that you are writing about, and how does the readers out there receive your publications or whatever you are writing about? So I think we need to be aware of that before we engage in our craft. So let me just talk briefly about my experiences in research. I'm lecturing, but I'm lecturing almost 6, if not 7 modules, which put a serious strain on myself as a researcher. So I think the key word is that the operating environment is increasingly becoming difficult. You see, our universities are changing their strategies now. They are talking of the university as a business, right? We are here to make money. We want to save our clients, the students, their clients. So you are teaching during the normal semester, conventional students. You are also teaching during block time, during the vacation. So technically, even time to rest, I think it's now expensive to come by. But I mean, that's the sad reality of our profession these days. I don't know, maybe the guys at UZ are better off because they don't have block. I think you should congratulate yourself on that front. All right. I think one of the biggest challenge that we have is on time management, like I've just highlighted. Recently, I think, if I'm not mistaken, our university says you should have 2 publications. I can't remember if it's per academic year or per semester. 2 publications per, let me just say, for an academic year. So when that was discussed, a number of questions were raised, especially the one to do with time. So I was just trying to look at how I would manage my time as an individual. And I think I could only come up with a week or 2 weeks when I will be free. So it's, when you look at 2, you think it's a small number, it doesn't matter, but for someone like me, it's a big challenge. You need to be able to work extra hard. The last time I was at the archives, I can't remember Mr. Moravio when I was at the archives, but I want to come to the archives to do my research, but sadly, maybe we are also a victim of our location down there in Masvingo. So for one to come to Harare to access the National Archives is also a big challenge. But in spite of that, let me say, I've tried to maybe look for funding for research and other things. I used to access funding from Codesria, but I think Codesria is now struggling. I'm not sure. I also approach other organizations like the Guggenheim Foundation. For those who are interested in studying violence, I think that's one area that you could approach the Guggenheim Foundation. I think they have got an initiative for young scholars, which they run after every 2 years. So if you could check the internet more constantly, you could get lucky someday. Then there are other opportunities that have come our way. Recently, I've had the good fortune of getting this. I can't remember the actual name, but it's a research initiative between the global north and the global south, where research is encouraged on empirical research. So I will be attending maybe the first workshop of that in the United States of America sometime in June. So, I mean, in spite of the challenges that I've highlighted, I think opportunities are still there that researchers can take advantage of. Let me not waste much time for the benefit of other colleagues, but this is the environment that we are in. We certainly have to survive within that particular environment. Let me finish by saying, when I was doing my PhD at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I was challenged by the fact that you would see a lecturer probably once a semester, and I was asking, what's happening? And they said, no, we take turns to teach. One semester the lecturer is teaching, the other semester is out doing research. I think maybe this may not be the right platform, but if we had policymakers, I think that would have helped us in terms of enhancing our course for research. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we are beginning to appreciate, especially the student body, when they see that we are not always available for them, you know. I actually had one student asking me during the vacation thing, so what are you doing this vacation since we are not there? They think we are just sleeping and waiting for them to come back to class, then we recite the same old notes. It's much more complicated than that. But let me take this opportunity to invite Professor Mazarire to come and give us his brief presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for doing. I don't know if this is going to be a presentation or a testimony in the typical Pentecostal perspective of a context. But I remind a story about the journey that I have probably walked to this stage, and it begins sometimes almost 2 decades ago. At a very dramatic point in the history of this country, but also in the history of academia. Certainly around 2000 or 1999, I got my first job here at the University of Zimbabwe in 1998, apparently as a teaching assistant, assisting very big scholars, important scholars whose shoes I couldn't even fit into. And naturally, it happened at a time when the economy went down. And everybody was leaving the university. And also at a time when the university was attracting so many students. At a time when the university was purportedly going the direction of postgraduate work. So it was then confronted with a contradiction, where you are in fact seeing the most experienced people leaving, And then you also experience a situation whereby inexperienced, hardly, well-groomed people actually taking over the reins of shepherding the academic process and, mentoring younger incoming students, getting into the picture. So, over and above this, there was also withdrawal of funding. I remember when I started at that time, we were given stipends, research stipends from the Swedish Agency for Research and Cooperation with Developing Countries, which was CITASARA. And I remember my stipend was something like 100,000 Zimbabwean dollars. And it was very difficult to actually even use it or even account for it, because part of the research that we were doing, we didn't have vehicles, we didn't have cars or anything. We used buses, and what you bring back as your proof of expenditure would be a bus ticket, which is like $19, and you are supposed to expend like 100,000. And by 2000, the year 2000, all that was gone. And what it did, therefore, it also left, we also experienced quite devastating infrastructural decay. I will confess that in the building just next to this, which was our faculty building, there was no functioning toilet. And some of the green vegetation that you see up there was actually sustained by I won't go into that detail, but that's the scenario. And the challenge, I think, as Michelle was saying earlier on, was actually also for us to continue with our work, completing PhDs under those circumstances. And part of the political work of doing that was actually completing a PhD in Africa, which was important because in the history of the history department, to be specific, there had never been a PhD ever done by a local scholar until about 2003, which was Sabelo Ndlovu, I think. So it was that call. Meanwhile, we also had to survive. We had to teach in moonlight. I think I was running between 3 jobs. I was teaching here, teaching at Arube College, teaching at other institutions, but also trying at the same time to make sure that the system continues under those circumstances. And I think in 2002, I found myself as the head of department. I think at the age of 25 or 26. But we again need to run the course of the youngest postgraduates at that time. And some of them, I'm proud to see them here. They've already finished their PhDs. But we ran these master's programs without PhDs and without any sort of serious qualifications, only the master's graduates. And indeed, I can state quite confidently that of the 3 cohorts that we ran between 2003 and 2009, those are the people that are actually forming the basis of the staff or the cohorts of staff in all the key institutions or history institutions in this country. These were made during those difficult times. And for us, it's a testimony rather than an indictment on actually working in those difficult conditions. But the point that I just want to make in this presentation is not to lament or cry or whatever, but to emphasize what we did to make or to turn bad situations into positive ones. And I think that should be the calling of most of the young scholars that are attending this workshop. That ultimately, it's we are not judged by what we say in complaints, but sometimes even by how many times we rise after we fall, or how many times we overcome difficult situations. And the situation in Zimbabwe, ultimately has changed. I mean, comparing to the time that I'm talking about. But the question is, how did we make it positive? How did we transform this into a positive thing? The first point I need to emphasize is actually production. One of my mentors who kept supporting us during this time, Professor Terence Rain, they used to tell me that the best way to write is to start writing. So at any point, you will find yourself in that scenario where you must be productive, start working. And that was kind of a very, very important driver to the kind of attitude and also the kind of morale that we built amongst ourselves. We also went around establishing networks, and charity begins at home. The best networks are the ones that are around you, or that are immediately around you. And we took advantage of the fact that we were only a kilometer away from the National Archives. And indeed, the director of the archives still remains Mr. Ivan Rabiwa here. And we started at a time when the archives was also experiencing a very difficult time. Not only were they experiencing brain drain of the most experienced staff, they were also underfunded. And in fact, they were understaffed. To the extent that we ended up having an arrangement where we would second our students, who would help with clearing the backlog, who would also help with accessioning, and who would also participate in the key projects that began to emerge even under those difficult times of lack of funding. I think at that time the government of the moment was generous enough to give the archives, I think it was the state lottery tickets, to get some kind of funding to help them, develop their repositories, to help them also come up with a maintenance sort of structure. But again, under the circumstances, we also felt that instead of being just consumers of archives, we should also be makers of archives. And we took advantage of the fact that being in Zimbabwe was actually being in or being knee deep into the actual primary material that needed to be collected. I'm talking about a time when the information systems had not been as democratic as they become. Now you can actually walk up to any Google Scholar account and download a whole book that you couldn't get in 2000 and 2005. Primarily because there's a new law that says everything published before the 1900s, you can get it for free. At that time, we used to rely on friends like George and others to send us books, to download articles for us to read, because even the internet here and elsewhere was not working. The bandwidth was very poor. So you would spend the whole day from morning to midnight trying to send an email, or even failing to open one. And some of you will be familiar with those kind of scenarios. But we try to make those situations work by actually making sure that we are in the field, and we should actually collect more information that builds the archives, that can be consumed by others when they come, at the time that we are also consuming what others left behind for us. And I think it was quite a moment of triumph, because ultimately several projects began to come our way, despite the difficulties of moving money. Sometimes it was not even about the case that we have of not finding money in the banks, but you find lots of money that was useless. Money that wouldn't take you anywhere. Money that wouldn't enable you to do any field. But still, each time we had opportunities to be on vacation, we used this to develop all sorts of oral interviews, or collect all sorts of information, and still develop an attitude of depositing with the archives. That's one thing that is also important. It's not about collecting and keeping them at home. It's about also having a culture of depositing. The other point was, what do you do with all these collections? We were slowly being turned into hunter-gatherers. We had then to adopt a policy of processing. And in between the period between around 2005 and about 2010, there were several projects that came through the university, through the archives, particularly in the area of the liberation struggle. And my own training had been in pre-colonial history. And what we began pushing is that despite the trend that had been there, the established trend that had been there in the University of Rhodesia, where in the history department, you should be confined to a topic, to a period, to a niche. You were either a pre-colonial historian or a colonial historian or a post-colonial historian. We began debunking that mythology. We began confronting those confinements, and it allowed us, even the research that we're doing, to cut across the chronological, pigeonholes. Partly because we were influenced by the fact that colonialism itself, despite its impact, only lasted around 100 years in Zimbabwe. So indeed, it was about collecting what happened before and what happened during those 100 years and what is happening now. And that sort of helped us actually build lots of resources. And I'm glad to say, as we speak right now, so many projects that we managed to do in these difficult years have actually become archives. Some of them have been uploaded online, some of them are accessible to various people. And I'm glad they were actually achieved. This is the last point I'm going to make. At a time when I know people have mentioned about funding and so forth, some of them were actually achieved with zero budgets. They were achieved with zero budgets. The sheer presence of people and researchers in areas that they worked in, or their homes. We promoted students, we encouraged research by students from their hometowns. Some people criticized, but ultimately they created archives that were actually geographically very spread out. And some of these have found their way into the archives, some of them have found their way into online archives and things like that. So I want to end with, I want to end triumphantly and say, over and above some of the limitations that we experience as researchers in Zimbabwe, we ultimately triumphed over those limitations. But also, it was because of the support that we got from the networks that we built here, and also the networks that we built internationally. That has been very rewarding, because ultimately we have built scholarship, we have built studies, we have built archives, and we have built repositories and collections that we have not only used, but that will be used by others who will come after us. I think that's the point I just wanted to mention.
Okay, thank you all for sharing these experiences. It's kind of intimidated to speak after Gerald, but I will do my best. So we've structured our presentations in the following manner, where I'm briefly going to tell you a little bit about the politics of doing research and the environment of doing research within the UK. Afterwards, Dan will tell you more about the kinds of research being done within the Department of International Development, and then Sumukai will speak specifically on his research experience here in Zimbabwe to give you a more detailed analysis of the kinds of research being produced within Oxford in relation to Zimbabwe. And just to start off in terms of the politics that we're dealing with, a lot of the experiences we've just heard really resonate with some of the issues we're dealing with as well, particularly the pressure to publish. We're all under a lot of that. The idea of how you balance teaching and research is one that's often under discussion unless you're in a research-heavy institution, which I think we're lucky Oxford is, but there are also lots of teaching-heavy institutions, and then you can't go away for longer periods of time. And the idea that the university is a business is one we're struggling with as well. We've just come out of a huge strike in the UK around pensions, but a lot of this was also focused around the idea of the marketization of the academy. So we're asking ourselves similar questions in terms of the raising of tuition fees within the UK as well. And we're dealing with potential withdrawal of funding around Brexit. So the UK leaving the EU might leave us in uncertain waters in terms of where our future research funding is going to come from. None of this compares, I think, to some of the pressures faced here, but just to say that we recognize what you say and can relate to it. And one thing that was really strong coming out of discussions around the striking, which I'm hearing back from your accounts as well, is the commitment of academics to educate and support students. And one thing really important in that is to continue conducting cutting edge or groundbreaking research. So hopefully we'll be able to tell you a little bit about this excellent research later, down in some title anyway. And I just want to tell you a little bit more about what structures the research agenda within the UK context. In case you're applying for research funding, it might be useful to keep this in mind. And this is a particular institutional challenge that we have, and I'm by no means an expert on these challenges, but just to share them with you. We are becoming more and more aware that decisions on what we research and how we research it don't occur in a vacuum. They're often the result of what funding we can get, and this funding is often public, and so you need to be held accountable for what you research. And one framework in which we do this is the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. And they often talk about impact, and we've heard a lot about impact all day today. But it's something that a lot of researchers within the UK universities are struggling to define and at times writing against because they don't find the impact measure one that is satisfying for their research agendas. And so the Research Excellence Framework in which this impact factor is located first took place in 2014, so it's a relatively new framework, but earlier assessments have been done. I won't tell you too much about them, it's pretty boring. But the next one's scheduled for 2021, and so new appointments being made within universities are often made with the idea of impact in mind. Can you provide a useful case study to show that your department has impact or not? And if you can do impactful research, you might have a higher chance of being recognized. And one of the ideas behind showing impact is that we can hold UK institutions of higher education, the universities, which receive these public funds accountable for how these public funds are actually used. And so you need to see the benefits of this investment. But at the same time, they also want to set a benchmark. They want to set some sort of signal for what good or proper use of these funds is. And they want to use this information to inform future research. So it's not just something that you do now that will have an impact on the investment community or on the business community in which you work with your research, but showing that you can do that kind of research might also inform where research funds go in the future. So a department that might not have a lot of impact, for instance, a department of history, not to say that history is not impactful, but often struggles to show more impact, might not receive as much public funding, and so we return to the question of the withdrawal of fundings and all the constraints that come with that. And so what are we actually looking at here? We're looking at three elements. We're looking at outputs of research, we're looking at impact of research, and we're looking at the research environment. And I'm just saying these three things to highlight to you that when you're applying for research funding, you might need to talk about outputs, and outputs are different from impact. Outputs relates to the classical things that we all expect researchers to do, to publish, to write a monograph, to write an article. And they can also relate to more creative forms, such as organizing an exhibition or a performance. But none of this is classified as impact. Impact is something more obscure, it's difficult to measure, and so also more debated. And the definition that we have for impact is that it's the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. And you can see this is pretty broad, some kind of contribution to society and the economy. And some argue, well, this is academic impact. You can show that you do excellent research, so you're contributing to knowledge, and that will, in some way, shape, or form, contribute to the society and the economy. But more often, the focus is on this economic and social impact. And here, it's very much framed as research that benefits individuals, organizations, and nations. And so, again, really broad. But I just want to draw attention to 3 ways in which we've often discussed this as being problematic. First, having to produce research that has an economic and societal impact may often limit your choice of topic, because what is important for a society and the economy is often set by a political agenda. And we're seeing, for instance, that a lot of research funding now is going to the question of migration. And while I don't object to people studying migration at all, if a lot of the money is concentrated in that area, the pot for other forms of research, such as the development of Shona language in a particular region of Zimbabwe, or whatever you might want to be studying, will not receive the same amount of attention or funding. Finally, or in addition to that, a second problematic aspect of focusing on impact very much is that there's a push to deliver. So this relates to the pressure that we have to publish, but the delivery here is not just the publication, it's engagement with policy managers, it's creating networks with business communities, or writing a paper for a newspaper article in a way that you have a shorter time frame to process your research needs and get the information out there quicker in an accessible manner. In and of itself, the accessibility of research is not a bad idea, but the pressure to get that done very quickly often means that you might cut corners or not do in-depth research that might be needed to fully understand the topic. And finally, thirdly, the problematic aspect is, what will your research actually be used for? Will it be used to inform academic debate and the academic discussion, or might it be taken up by a particular policy organization to push for a very narrow agenda that you never intended and your research participants never intended to be a part of or want to be informed by? So this then leads to questions of research ethics, which I'll leave to the side now because I'm talking way too long. But all these questions are ones that we're asking ourselves, and they're struggles that come out of being asked to show that our research has impact. And one positive thing, I don't just want to say that being asked to show impact is negative. One positive thing, or one benefit that does come out of this new focus on impact within the UK academic setting is also an increased discussion around creating collaborations and really emphasizing, and I know none of us, or many of you probably don't think of this as a new idea, but for some reason in the UK they do. The idea is that impact will be more effective if you work with your communities rather than on the communities that you research. Doesn't seem like the newest idea. Anusha definitely mentioned the horse-rider relationship that's existed in the past that we should be changing. So this goes alongside that and just highlights that collaboration is something that we do want to invest in. And hopefully, by organizing workshops such as this, we can create impact of a positive kind in that manner and open up avenues to work together. And Dan will tell you more about ways in which we can potentially collaborate by focusing on the research areas in QEH.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm going to be a lot less comprehensive. Perhaps a less rigorous scholar. Sometimes in Oxford you'll bump into American tourists walking around the place and they're looking around slightly confused and dazed and they get in your way, which is irritating. But they say, so where is the university? And we're like, what? There's a bit there and there's a bit over there and there's a bit over there. And it's like, okay. So where is the university though? Because it's like a lot of American campuses are similar to this one, right? There is a university enclosed out of town. Whereas in Oxford it's split up and you've got bits, it's all this old medieval history in this city. It's all split up and it's decentralized in many ways. And that's similar to how the research agenda in Oxford works as well. It's very, very decentralized. So we don't have like kind of a coordinating body per se, although as Sam has mentioned, in terms of like the overall research direction from government, there is that is targeted funding. But in terms of what academics research themselves, there's an awful lot of freedom and movement to study whatever it is that you want to study in Oxford. That said, I want to talk a little bit about QEH, or the Department for International Development, and what are some of the key trends in research that's going on there at the moment. And just to give you a flavour of like what it is that people are really considering, thinking about, and what it is that kind of like really interesting ideas are being fired up around, which would hopefully give you kind of some sort of basis for thinking about how we could organise collaborations. So broadly in the department in which Sana, Simokai, I and Josh work, and of which Wiles is no longer, I guess, broadly there are four broad themes, thematic areas in which all research is meant to fall. The first is this wonderfully broad category: political change, conflict, and the environment. Broad. The second is human development, poverty, and children. Again, very broad. The third is migration, refugees in a global context. And the last one is economic development and international institutions. And these are all really big, broad research agendas. But they don't really adhere to what it is that people are necessarily doing. They're kind of more of a like convenient bureaucratic function. So what I want to do now is just give you kind of our take on what some of these trends in research actually are. And I think the first of these, which is kind of like really cutting edge in terms of the title of the platform today, is the nature of the African state and citizenship, and the ways in which that's different and changes. You know, there's been an awful lot of instrumentalist understandings of the African state in kind of late 80s that's beginning to be revised in a really, really interesting and kind of constructive way. So people like Shivala and Deleuze and Bayard, that sort of literature is being really challenged in a really interesting and new set of ways by many, many people, certainly in the department. So they're interested in the ways in which bureaucracies work, how that affects how the state is configured and where that comes from. So both Josh and Simokai work on this, and I think Simokai is going to talk about a specific issue of that in his talk about healthcare reform. So that's one. So the developing nature of state and citizenship. The second is about migration. Migration movement, displacement, and also transnationalism. So here we've got that kind of the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, and there's a migration masters as well. So the ways in which people are forced to move or choose to move, and what the sort of politics around that. This is less kind of regionally focused. So there's not exactly, most of the people that work on this stuff is more thematically based. And that's all driven by kind of like, it's very, very, a lot of it is quite policy orientated towards what sort of research can be done in order to inform policies on refugees and forced migrations. But there is also a kind of a transnational component of that. So Joss's new project is on transnational movements in Southern Africa, which is again, so there is a kind of more historical sense to that. The third area is youth and aging. So in Oxford, there's been in our department, there's been a program called the Young Lives Program, which is the largest funded program by DFID, which had traced, it was a big, huge, mixed method study that looked at a longitudinal study of people's lives over 17 years. So how the issues that they faced changed over 17 years. And it was both a big quantitative study, looking at populations in 5 different countries across the world, as well as a qualitative study. So people considering oral histories and the ways in which people's lives have changed at different stages, what their expectations and aspirations for the future are, and whether or not they're met. This ties in with education and educational programming. So that's another area, so youth. And that's where my work itself comes in on this. So my work is all on youth and students. And I'm interested in the ways in which, you know, young people's aspirations, what happens when they're not met or when they are met, and what are they willing to do in order to kind of try and achieve that. That's the third area, youth. The fourth area, I think, ties in more closely with Sana's interests around law, and also George's interests, George Karikwawa, who's now at Edinburgh. But looking at the ways in which the law is constructed, used, and contested, and its links to the African state. So not seeing the law as some sort of static, kind of like objective set of principles, but really looking at the kind of it as a form of social creation, as a political creation that justifies a particular form a border and also can be used to contest that border as well. And the last area, which I'm just going to talk about today, very briefly, is about economics and the Centre for Growth. So we've got a lot of economists within our department as well. Our head of department at the moment is a guy called Christopher Adam, who's a developmental economist. And he is very, very interested in the ways in which African economies grow or don't grow, and kind of the ways in which that can be brought about. In particular, he organises an annual event with all of the central bank governors across Africa, where they come to Oxford and they have these closed-door deliberations about what sorts of financial changes and monetary changes need to take place. There's lots of really interesting work that's kind of going on there with regards to economics and growth in the global south, and in particular in Africa. So these are the kind of key trends that I see that our department are interested in. So if you're interested in any of those aspects, I strongly encourage you to consider developing collaborations with or consider studying in QH. And to give you a kind of a much more granular sense of what this actually looks like, Simbukai is just going to talk a bit about his work now, that his most recent project. Cool.
Thanks very much, Dan. So, in December 2008, I was a medical student at Newcastle University. And I was supposed to fly home that winter to spend Christmas here in Zimbabwe, but was unable to do so because I couldn't afford the ticket. And this was, of course, the time after the fraught 2008 elections, and I'd been following events at home very closely. And it was on the 9th of December, I came across this very startling article in the New York Times. It was entitled, "Cholera Epidemic Sweeping Across Crumbling Zimbabwe." And the piece began by recounting how the 5 youngest members of the Chibunu family had died of this diarrheal disease. Now, the name obviously caught my attention. And as I read on, the piece described how the 5 kids had been playing in the sort of sewage-flooded streets of Chitungwiza. They imbibed sewage, not realizing what they were consuming, and within less than 24 hours, all 5 children began purging and vomiting, and soon passed away. The piece then went on to claim that the children's bodies left, dried out, desiccated, their organs shut down, was something of an analogy for the state of public services in Zimbabwe that at that stage seemed to be at the point of virtual collapse. And of course, as this was all happening, numerous international agencies, media houses, governments were lambasting the situation in Zimbabwe, claiming that our government at the time was responsible for state collapse. At the same time, there was a kind of vitriolic response to these accusations, where the late Minister of Information, Sikaniso Glovu, said that cholera was a biological attack from the West to bring about a genocide and undermine the sovereignty of the ruling party. So the cholera outbreak itself had in fact began in August of 2008. It rapidly spread through the high-density areas around Tivase, Kwatana, Bulililo, and so forth, before spreading into peri-urban and then rural areas, and finally crossing the country's borders into South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique. Over a 10-month period, cholera infected nearly 100,000 people and claimed the lives of nearly 5,000. And at the peak of the epidemic, it had an exceptionally high case fatality rate, making the 2008-2009 cholera outbreak the most extensive in recorded African history. Now, of course, as I've suggested, the cholera outbreak had a great deal to say about a host of other things that were happening in Zimbabwe. It was squarely situated within the failures to provide adequate water and sanitation in many parts of the country that needed it most. On top of this, there was the collapse of many healthcare services, both in response and in prevention. The outbreak became deeply politicized, where we had on one hand claims that the Zimbabwe state had failed versus the vitriolic claims in the name of state sovereignty. And this is sort of what drew me into this topic. It at once spoke to my medical interest to understand how a preventable and easily treatable disease came to wreak such devastation. But it also took me beyond the purview of medicine and public health into the realm of interdisciplinary social science with a particular focus on politics. Cholera, I contended, has a great deal to say about public services, about how people come into contact with the state, about policy decisions that are taken, and about the distribution and inequalities of power and resources within society, and also about the kinds of responses that obtain at a global level when they see yet another African tragedy unfolding. So my thesis and now current book project tries to take a panoramic view of the cholera outbreak, understanding it across all of these different political facets. And I essentially make three major arguments. The first is I historicize the outbreak and argue that it was a man-made disaster. In fact, I contend that to really understand the cholera outbreak, one has to go as far back as the late 19th century, when Salisbury was founded as the colonial capital of southern Rhodesia, because this laid down the groundwork for the distribution and access to water and sanitation facilities and to housing developments that then sort of characterized urban planning throughout the colonial period. I then look at how these processes changed since independence and then later on in the crisis years, and argue that by 2008 we see a profound convergence of a host of political, economic, and structural factors that precipitated a devastating outbreak. The sort of next strand of argument I deploy in the study is I look at how different kinds of communities, organizations, government bodies, and international entities responded to the outbreak. And I argue that the extreme urgency about cholera, the fact that it kills with such rapidity, that its death is gruesome, it entails the most horrific of bodily experiences, embedded within a collective imagination the imperative of saving lives. However, I show that the exigency of saving lives failed to address some of the fundamental structural drivers behind the cholera outbreak. And so the situation that obtained was this incredible mobilization to deal with the immediate humanitarian need of getting intravenous fluid into collapsed veins or in distributing aquatabs in communities that need them. While at the same time, it was fundamentally unable to deal with the deeper structural problems, say around housing, water and sanitation, as well as some of the political challenges that brought about the cholera outbreak. And so paradoxically, the humanitarian relief effort achieved its short-term goal of arresting the cholera outbreak, but in many ways compounded extant social inequalities in the country. And then the final argument I look at is how the cholera outbreak reshaped ideas of citizenship, about what it means to belong within Zimbabwean society. Here I took a much more granular perspective and spent a lot of time speaking to people in parts of Harare that were epicenters of the disease. So I conducted interviews across areas such as Glenview, Glenora, Buliro, Tiverasekwa, Kwazana, Mapuku, and so forth. And in many of my interviews, my informants not only unleashed tremendous anger at how they felt they'd been abandoned and dispossessed during the outbreak, but they actually went as far as saying that not only were they afflicted by the human waste produced by cholera, but they began to see themselves as waste. Thus, like cholera's diarrhea, they felt superfluous to, unwanted by, and expelled from the body politic. At the same time, however, I argue that memories of modernization, of development, and of public welfare in this country continue to shape how people talk about what it might mean to be a Zimbabwean citizen. And so, in as much as people talked about the devastating circumstances of 2008 and 2009, they went on to articulate a vision of public welfare and inclusion of which they were a part. Thus, many of my informants said that what they wanted to see was a Zimbabwe restored to the path of progress, where the awful legacies of the crisis years were frozen in time and could be recovered from. Of course, however, the realities of achieving that are a different matter. And so all of this then, and this study is one of many within the department that speaks to what Dan was saying on wider debates about how we think about the African state, how we think about citizenship, how we think about political subjectivity, how we think about state-society interactions. And I think it's quite typical of our department for many scholars to take very specific events or topics or issues and use them to illuminate a much wider landscape. And so ultimately, one could say that the cholera outbreak as devastating as it was, might not be the most important event in Zimbabwe's history, and yet it serves as a profound insight, a profound window onto a host of different features of Zimbabwean society that converged during the 2008-2009 period. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We just have maybe 5 minutes if there are any questions that some people may want to ask. Or comments, just 5 minutes. Are there any comments, questions? While our speakers are still up here. Okay, if we don't have any questions or comments, I think we are going to move to probably what could be some of our favorite. All right, we're now going to take a break, a tea break. We're going to just for 10 minutes. We are behind time, so let's all be back here by 5:05, so that we can move on with our time. Tea is ready, we can be served there, but let's quickly come back immediately after, then we can move on.